Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for Nonprofit HR's virtual learning educational event. Today's session is entitled Onboarding Your Nonprofit C-Suite Executive, How to Make a Lasting Impression. My name is Alicia Shashinsky, and I'm the Managing Director for Talent and Development at Nonprofit HR, and I'll be moderating your conversation today. We have a lot of great content to cover, so let's get started. Today, you're going to walk away with a solid understanding of how to create a stellar onboarding experience for your next executive hire. But let's go over a few items so you know how to best participate in today's event. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default, but if you prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in instructions will be displayed. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and answer some during the session, but we'll also have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Today's session will be recorded and you will receive a follow-up email within the next few days with a link to view the recording. You'll also receive some assets. Live webinar attendees will also receive codes for SHRM and HRCI recertification. And now let's talk about today's presenters. Denisha Martin is an executive recruiter and trusted advisor on the firm's retained executive search engagements through Impact Search Advisors. Denisha's experience spans search, talent acquisition, and human resources. Denisha has successfully managed the staffing and recruitment needs for clients ranging from small and mid-sized operations to Fortune 500 organizations in both the for-profit and nonprofit sectors. She is gifted in assessing talent, adept in relationship building, and known for her professionalism and creative strategic approach. Jamie Armstrong serves as a trusted advisor on search engagements nationally. This includes being responsible for the successful closure of search engagements at the professional and executive levels, using unique search methodologies and strategies. Jamie's experience spans corporate recruiting, agency recruiting, and client relations in several industries and sectors, including for-profit and nonprofit organizations, government contracting, and international development. And now we'll hear from Myra Briggs, Managing Director for Impact Search Advisors by Nonprofit HR, or ISA. Myra's experience spans executive and professional search, talent acquisition, and leadership development. Myra is responsible for the strategy and guidance of ISA, including building and leading a team of executive and professional level search and research consultants who engage in client-facing work nationally. Myra is going to kick off our discussion by sharing a little information about what ISA has been up to and why today's topic is absolutely essential. Myra will also join us for the Q&A session, so please prepare to add your questions to the chat panel later on. So Myra, now I hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Alicia. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today, and we just want to thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedules to spend some time talking about a very important subject, onboarding your C-suite executive. But before we get into that, I want to tell you a little bit about Impact Search Advisors. You may be hearing the name and wondering, is it a new company? Are we the same thing as Nonprofit HR? And the answer to both of those questions is no, and then yes. We are a program of Nonprofit HR, and which encompasses the entire client-facing search function of the organization. We work on executive search as well as professional search, recruitment outsourcing, temp staffing, and interim leadership. So whatever your needs happen to be around talent acquisition or recruitment for your nonprofit organization, we're here to help. We still have the full backing of the 20 plus years of experience of nonprofit HR, as well as all of the subject matter expertise that comes along with working with the rest of the firm and the rest of our subject matter areas. So let's jump into what we're going to talk about today. One of the places where I started in working at Nonprofit HR was in the executive search practice. And we spent a lot of time, organizations spend a lot of money hiring new executives. And one of the things that they very infrequently forget to prioritize is the onboarding of your new C-suite executives. Onboarding is so vitally important that If you ever ask a person when they're getting ready to leave an organization, whether they had a positive experience or a negative experience, chances are they're going to talk to you about their first day in the organization. And it is up to you to make sure that it is impactful and lays a nice, firm foundation for a successful tenure in the organization. Let's talk about investment. If you have employed a firm like Impact Search Advisors by Nonprofit HR to assist with your executive search, you have invested not only your time, but also your resources in ensuring that you are able to secure the right executive for furthering the mission of your organization. Think of successful onboarding as an investment protection activity. You want to make sure that the new leader that you bring on knows your organization, knows where some of the landmines might be, but more than anything else, that they feel welcome, that they feel engaged, and they feel a part of the team. My team today, Denisha and Jamie, are going to spend some time going through some best practices, as also exploring some of the ways that you felt about your onboarding practices. And we encourage you to submit your questions throughout the process of the webinar, as well as at the end. And we're looking forward to an engaging and collaborative discussion on such an important topic. Ladies?
Thank you so much for that lead-in, Myra. Really excited to be here and talking to you guys today about how to make a lasting impression when onboarding your C-suite executive. But before we get into some of the content, I'd like to talk a little bit more about Denisha and myself. I am Jamie Armstrong, as mentioned. I am coming to you guys today out of Bowie, Maryland. I identify with the she, her, hers pronoun series. And as earlier mentioned, I am a search consultant with Impact Search Advisors by Nonprofit HR. So I know, Denisha, you and I have talked a little bit about what brought me to the organization, but tell me what made you say yes to Impact Search Advisors by Nonprofit HR.
That is a great question, Jamie. And first of all, thank you to Alicia and to Myra for setting this up for us. It's going to be a great conversation, and I'm really happy to be co-hosting with you, Jamie. So just by way of introduction, my name is Denisha Martin. I use the she series pronouns. I have been at Impact Search Advisors since February of 2019, a little over 2 years, but I think we can say about 5 years because COVID years are kind of like dog years, right? I think total we're right around 5 years now. Anyhow, I've been working in search and talent acquisition for a while. I'm calling in from Northwest DC. So if any of you are in Uptown, I am your neighbor. And just a quick location acknowledgement, I would like to say, we want to acknowledge that Washington, D.C. is the traditional territory of the Nacotchtank, the Anacostan, and the Piscataway Indigenous people. But we also want to acknowledge that there are generations of African peoples that were brought to this land against their will and do not have the privilege of acknowledging their land of origin. So thank you for the space to acknowledge the land. But back to your question, Jamie, why did I say yes to ISA? Well, it's the representation for me. If I'm honest, having an opportunity to meet Myra in action, having an opportunity to meet our managing partner, Patty Hampton, and having an opportunity to meet the very impressive Lisa Brown Alexander, and seeing these women of color in this corporate environment doing what they do was just phenomenal for me. And quite frankly, an example that I had not seen before, not to that level. So I saw myself in the leadership, and I could see a clear path to my own development and career pathing. So that's part of why I said yes, one of the biggest reasons why I said yes. So now I'm going to ask you, why did you say yes to Impact Search Advisors?
So I'll share your sentiments. As mentioned earlier, I come from a number of different industries, and in the current climate of our country in general, it was just a really exciting time and opportunity for me to be a part of working with an organization that is working with other very mission-driven organizations. I find that to be a lot more satiating, like I said, based on the climate of our country and just me personally. So really excited to be here, excited I said yes. And excited to be co-hosting this with you today, Denisha. So moving right along, we are going to do a self-reflection exercise where we're going to talk about our best and worst onboarding experience. We are going to ask for some participation from our attendees, and we're going to ask that you share with us just in one word, how did you feel with your least favorable onboarding experience? I know there's a lot of you, so we'll give you guys a little bit of time to think about that and participate. But while our attendees are thinking, Denisha, what's your one word?
Only one?
Just one word.
One word.
I know, it'll pain you. One word.
I know. Okay. Well, I'm not going to choose a 4-letter word, but the one word that I would
One
choose,
PC word.
one PC word, I would say frazzled, to be honest, because for me, just to add some context to that, when you're starting a new job, it's like moving. You know how discombobulating moving is, and nobody likes to move. Now, starting a new job in a new firm can be very exciting, but if when you arrive, or even the days leading up to your arrival, no one's prepared for your arrival, you don't know, where do you make a copy of something? Where is the bathroom, for crying out loud? And then let alone all the cultural nuances that are going on in that environment. And, unfortunately, I have had an experience where those things were not thought through strategically. And so, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks in, I just felt frazzled. And it wasn't the best starting point. I'm curious, Alicia, and I'm not sure if you're getting any audience participation. I hope that you are. Can we check in to see if there are any one word that would come to mind for this 70 plus people that are on the line right now?
Yes, Tanisha, we do have one so far. Somebody mentioned displaced. Oh, here comes another one. Disoriented.
Kind of like pulling up to your new house and not having the keys.
That's it.
There you go.
That's absolutely it. Wow. So what about you, Jamie? Oh, did you say another one?
There was another one that was unprepared, unwanted.
Absolutely. That's a tough list of words. I mean, I don't think that any of us on the line who represent employers would be pleased to know that our new talent comes in feeling those things. Jamie, what would you say is your one word?
I would probably say my one word would be disappointed, because, to your point, it's a big move, it's a big adjustment, and you want to know that everybody that was a part of that move and that adjustment was on board and prepared for what that looked like. So it sounds like, at least you and I and the two attendees in the chat that participated have experienced it. We've certainly heard some horror stories, but we've both discussed great onboarding experiences, and we've had some conversations with clients and candidates that have had really good experiences. So I'm going to ask that the attendees, maybe a little bit more than two this time, will take a moment to think about a time that their onboarding went well, and then type in the question section one word that made you feel good about your onboarding. And while our attendees are dying to participate with us today, I will ask you, Denisha, what's your one word?
Well, for this one, the one that comes to mind first is welcome, and I know that welcome might seem like a word that is not that important when it comes to the work environment or your corporate lifestyle, but I would differ. We spend the majority of our waking hours, if we're fortunate, at work. And so being able to say that you feel welcome is important. I remember arriving at Impact Search Advisors by Nonprofit HR, and people saying to me, welcome home. And I just felt like, wow, that's really different. That's really nice. And I did feel welcomed home because of the strategy and the thoughtfulness that went into my onboarding and my acclimation experience. Alicia, let me check in with you. Are you seeing any positive words about positive onboarding experiences?
Yes, and Denisha, before we do that, it just took a couple minutes for people to get things actually in the questions box. So we did get a lot of other responses to the question about the negative experiences. So I was just going to read a few more words before we talk about the positive.
Perfect.
People mentioned overwhelmed, rushed, afraid to ask stupid questions, unseen, troubled. So there were a lot of good ones there.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the more positive side, people said excited. Let me get down here a little bit. Welcomed, necessary in a positive way. Appreciated, that was mentioned a couple times. Welcome was mentioned. Inspired, felt people were prepared and the company was organized, and valued. So those were the key ones that came through.
Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you for going back too, because it really does paint quite a picture of just how powerful a negative versus a positive onboarding experience can be. So of course, I want to check in with you, Jamie. Tell us about your best onboarding experience to date.
So my one word is probably going to be impressive. To date, it was my onboarding with Impact Search Advisors by Nonprofit HR. And I chuckle because this isn't a plug because Myra's listening. It was really just an impressive onboarding experience. And I felt that everyone in the company, even the groups and the departments that I don't touch or work with, I could just tell everyone knew that I was coming. There had been some dialogue about me joining the team leading up to that. It was evident. All of my technology, obviously, a lot of us are operating in a remote environment. All of my technology was delivered long before my first day. Leading up to my first day, I had a detailed agenda that covered over about 4 weeks worth of orientation and just getting me acclimated and familiarized. And our president and CEO actually sent me a Starbucks gift card. So I have been enjoying a lot of Starbucks throughout the course of the pandemic. So in addition to all of the other things that I shared before that, that was a really nice touch and cherry on the top. And it was just a really great start to a new opportunity.
Wow, that I know you said that it wasn't supposed to be a plug, but it almost sounds like a commercial, and that makes me feel
matter experts.
Yeah, as somebody who's been here for a couple of years, that is the experience that we're laying out there. And hey, since we're on the subject of a commercial, we do happen to be hiring because nonprofit HR is growing. So just putting it out there, into the atmosphere. But in all seriousness, do you want your new employees to feel that first list of words that came through that Alicia read out, or do we want them to feel the latter?
Well, I think it's the latter, and it was nice the way Alicia ended up having to present that, because we really got to see negative to positive kind of side by side and pretty significantly contrasting. And I think that, like you said, anyone that is involved in employment would like for their new employee to fall on the more positive side of the list. So hopefully today, when Denisha and I are all done, you all will feel that you have some really good insight on how to make a lasting impression when onboarding your C-suite executive. So with that being said, I am going to go over the agenda. We are going to talk about what this looks like before day one. We're going to talk about what it looks like within the first 30 days, 30 to 90 days, beyond 90 days, and then an opportunity for a question and answer. So with that being said, I am going to pass it to you, Denisha.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. It's funny because oftentimes when you think about onboarding, the temptation is, okay, it's that first week. Make sure they know where everything is, make sure they have whatever equipment they need, and then we'll move on and they'll hit the ground running. But as you said, onboarding, it starts before the person ever opens the door of the office building, or as it may be, before they ever log on for the first day of their virtual telework experience. And I think it might be a helpful discussion, Jamie, if we just outline what the difference between onboarding and orientation is, because I think a lot of times it's used interchangeably, and there are some nuances there. So let's talk about that. Onboarding is literally the overall process. So when I think about onboarding, it's the full umbrella of everything that it requires to build engagement from the very first contact with the employee until that person becomes truly established within the organization. Now, orientation, on the other hand, is a stage within onboarding where your new employee is going to learn about the company, learn about their job responsibilities, learn kind of where things lie, whether physically or virtually. I remember a big part of my orientation was how to use Dropbox, how to use the shared file system, how to make sure everything was syncing. All of these things are a part of orientation because it is a stage within the overall onboarding process. But the onboarding process literally starts before you ever arrive and goes well beyond the first 90 days, which again, is not necessarily intuitive. So now that we have that clear, let's go a little bit deeper into that time before your executive leader arrives. So one thing you want to remember is in human resources, there's this difference, this nuance between treating someone as a human resource and treating them as a human, right? So one thing that is helpful to keep in mind, especially everyone, but I was going to say especially for the smaller nonprofit who may not necessarily have the longest, largest budget and runway to do all the bells and whistles, is to think about this experience the way you would think about a really very important person coming into your home for the very first time. So, for instance, in my family, a very important person might be a Michelle Obama type of person, right? If I'm aware that Michelle Obama is coming to my home, I am not starting the preparation for that the day that she's arriving. I'm months in advance preparing for Michelle Obama to arrive at my home. And so when you think about, as Myra said, the investment into the search, whether you did it internally or whether you did your search with a partner like ISA, for example, either way, the investment of time, the investment of capital is significant. And so you want to help take your new leader from candidate status to fully integrated executive leader within your organization. So this requires high touch, what we like to say, red carpet treatment, a very warm welcome. And what that might look like is some of the examples that you gave, Jamie. I love the Starbucks card, or a card to Just Tea, which is a wonderful fair trade tea organization, or whatever it is that the person enjoys. Maybe a week's worth of DoorDash so that they don't have to be encumbered thinking about food while they get acclimated. Maybe there is a swag bag or a nice little merch basket where you've got the logo of your organization on things like thumb drives and pens and a notepad and just a couple of different office items that are very welcoming and that align with the job responsibilities. Another way to present a warm welcome is that human touch. Right now things are starting to open up, but it's a little nebulous. And also, depending on your organization, it may be spread out across the country. But if your organization uses platforms like Zoom and Slack and Teams and such, encourage your existing staff to pop in on your new executive and say, hey, I know I don't have a scheduled time, but I just wanted to leave you this message. I just want to leave you this note to say we're so happy to have you. Cannot wait for our first formal meeting, but I'm just so excited. I want you to feel welcome. And so I'm saying hello. Those kinds of things go a long way because, again, we're talking about human beings, not just in the framework of human resources. The questionnaire. So this is something that I've seen done at an organization that just blew me away. What they did is in their initial welcome packet, which was a beautiful bouquet of flowers, Jamie, they had the Starbucks card. They had, all the little merchandise and swag gifts with the logo, and they had all those nice things. And they had a handwritten note from the team that said, we're so glad to have you as our new executive director. But in there, they said, if you would humor us and fill out a few of your favorite things, and I'm dating myself, but that was one of my very favorite movies in The Sound of Music. And she sings this song, these are a few of my favorite things. Well, anyway, the questionnaire was a list of the favorite things. And what it did, Jamie, is it equipped this organization to recognize and celebrate their executive in their own love language of their favorite things. They knew where they liked to go to lunch. They knew where that person thought the best pizza was served. They knew where that person liked to spend time outside of work and what they liked to do with their family. They knew their favorite candy bar. They knew all of these juicy little tidbits so that along the way, they could just shower little things on their executive. And that goes such a long way. So consider that. And the meet and greets, I kind of sat out of order, but again, in this virtual environment, use the tools. I do enjoy when colleagues pop up and ping me on Zoom, and all I have to do is join and say, hey, Jamie, how are you? I'm so glad you stopped by my virtual door today. What's going on with you? And we can have a little chat. And this is a wonderful way to make your executive feel welcome, especially if they are in a virtual environment. Some of us, man, we have people in our firm who we still have not met in person. And Jamie, you and I can attest to that. So those are a few great ideas and best practices that I've seen. Some other best practices on the next slide include some of the box checking that needs to happen. So if we'll go to the next slide, I'll share with you the pre-hire documents, manuals, pre-reading. Think about it like this. When you are starting your new opportunity and it's not virtual, on the first day or prior to the first day, you get kind of your paperwork stack, and you got to show your ID for the I-9, and you got, I'm talking to HR folks, so y'all know what I'm talking about. You got to do all the things. You got to, bring out your insurance card. You got to fill out all the things. You can put all of that on a thumb drive and share it with your new executive, and even give them a couple tips about, hey, here are some apps that we like to use to make life easier. You may want to upload XYZ app, which is a scanner that you can just use your phone to point and shoot and then send these back to assigned. Give them the keys to the city, so to speak, so that your executive is not, scrounging around trying to figure out, well, do I need to go to the post office to get this back to them? Like, make it clear what those lines of communication and what those lines of producing those kinds of documents are. If you got manuals and all kinds of pre-reading, maybe some white papers that really help to frame who your organization is and how they are seen and viewed in their external communities, send that all over on the thumb drive and just say, hey, I know it's a month out or 3 weeks out or 2 weeks before you start with us, but I thought if you were curious or, we're looking for some centering around your first day and your first couple of weeks experience with us, that this pre-reading might be helpful. You can do the same thing with the technology toolkit. Jamie, how soon did you have your workstation before you started?
I want to say a week.
A week before. That's fantastic. And at the same time, the software, the home office workstation, I remember it wasn't exactly a part of my onboarding, but if I had been new at this time, Nonprofit HR rolled out a program where we receive $100 toward our home office needs. And there's nothing to fill out. Literally, you just see it on your pay stub as a credit. And it's such a wonderful benefit. And it really feels like love and care because, when you go to Amazon or wherever you go and you got to get another couple reams of paper or ink or whatever it is that you need, that you have that little cushion that your employer provided for you. So things like that, make that plain in your welcome packet and say, hey, you may not have had a chance to go through the entire workplace policy, but one perk we have is this. And then last but absolutely not least, please, please, please think carefully about the communication strategy for your new executive. They will need a professional headshot. They will need a well-written bio. They will need a press release. And it's kind of painful after they go through a really rigorous vetting process that on the other side of that, a week goes by, 2 weeks go by, 3 weeks, God forbid, a month goes by before anyone in the external community knows that they exist. So a best practice is once they sign on the dotted line, go ahead and send them the template for the bio, send them the template for the press release, get a quote or two from them. And that way you can draft it out, get their approval, and then those documents can go out and hit the airwaves on day one, or certainly by the end of the first week. So these are just some things that can be helpful. I mean, I've even heard of, and I think this is phenomenal, I heard of an executive leading up to before their day one, someone met them out in the park with their iPhone on portrait mode, took some beautiful headshots of them because they didn't have a good bio. They didn't have a good headshot. Why didn't they have a good headshot? Because it was their very first executive director role. Mm-hmm. So they never needed one. Their LinkedIn was like them and their cat or something like that. So someone facilitated that process, and that felt like a little TLC. Again, these are things that are well within the budget, no matter how big or how small that budget may be. And hopefully our audience members took a couple of tips from what can happen beyond, or rather before that person ever comes through the door. I'm going to hand it off to you, Jamie, to take us into the first 30 days.
Before we move on from the before day one, I just want to point out a lot of the things that you shared are not labor intensive. They don't require a lot of effort. They require a lot of thought. And I just want to point out that the return on that small investment is going to be huge. So
Well
definitely
said.
worth it. So I am going to take us beyond day one and go into the first 30 days, where we are going to talk about how to get your new executive acclimated to the role, the staff, culture, and ways to support them in establishing credibility and relationships. So let's talk about some best practices. So the first best practice that we're going to talk about is encourage your executive to take their time. These are typically high-performing professionals, and they are anxious to come in and hit the ground running. You want to encourage them, again, to take their time, give themselves an opportunity to really dive into the culture, give themselves an opportunity to get to know everyone, kind of discover where all the tools are, how the tools are to be used within the first month. And really just all in all, you want to encourage them to pace themselves. Relationships at that level are going to be important. And we want to leave space for our executive early on to build relationships. A DI tip is remember that your leader might feel additional pressure to perform. So you, again, want to communicate to them that they have the margin to center relationship building first. Another thing that you want to talk about within the first 30 days with your executive is hot issues. So an example of hot issues might be a key staff member that maybe is looking or interested in transitioning out. There may be funders that are threatening to leave or discontinue their partnership. You may have lease needs. Your lease may be ending. You may be looking for new space. Just really anything that is going to require the executive's attention within the first 90 days. You may be tempted here to talk about priorities and measurable goals, but obviously opportunities for deeper discussions around that will come later. So our DEI tip for that piece is if your organization has endured any trauma related to racial injustice, be sure to address this head on with your new executive. So within the first 30 days, you also want them to be comfortable and versed on HR and workplace policies and compliance. Pretty self-explanatory there. Next slide, please. You also want to make sure that you have talked to them about programs, projects, and just a day-to-day overview so they have an idea what they're getting themselves into. The next piece is a technology briefing. Our hope is that that briefing is on the heels of the technology toolkit that was provided that Denisha shared. And so it should really be designed to provide a high level of just initial familiarity with critical systems and procedures. And they're going to be crash courses, but they're going to support your new executive just by giving them a general technological lay of the land. Something else Denisha and I talked about, our executives being assigned technology buddies. So this is ideally someone that is officially or unofficially a subject matter, someone that's versed on the way the organization uses technology. The next point is introductions to staff and board. You want to facilitate the scheduling so that the executive can engage staff early. Remember, we talked about the importance of relationship building in this role. This is going to be informally and formally. They are going to want an opportunity to begin assessing the strengths and opportunities of their team. This is a great time to start those introductions. And it's also going to give the executive an opportunity to lay the foundation of mutual trust and just really an opportunity to establish some synergy. So this could look like coffee meetings, virtual happy hours, virtual town halls, and as well as all staff meetings. So another similar point is within the first 30 days, you're going to want to facilitate introductions to external stakeholders. You want to schedule a formal meet and greet with the organization's most critical stakeholders, obviously the folks outside of the staff, any advisory boards or membership communities that apply, external partners, funding partners, and sometimes past leadership might even be relevant. So a DEI tip when you are scheduling these stakeholder introductions is to consider representation when you are scheduling these meet and greets. So we are at before day one covered. We know exactly what to do. We have a deeper dive in the first 30 days. And so next we're going to move on to 30 to 90 days and beyond. But before we do that, I thought we should stop and check in with Alicia to see if anyone in the audience has any questions.
That's great, Jamie. And while Alicia is teeing up any questions, I love that just the way that you framed it. It's like, okay, so Michelle Obama is coming home. She's coming to our home. And so we're going to lay out that red carpet and everything's going to be super high touch. And we'll have her favorite fragrance in a potpourri on the pillow of her bed. That's all before she arrives. But then once she arrives, then we're getting a little bit deeper. We're making sure that she knows exactly where the kitchen is and the bathroom is and where she can find. So, you know, using that analogy, we're just moving right on through that that process there. Alicia, are you seeing any questions out there? Any submitted questions from our attendees?
Yes, Tanisha. We have one question asking about the role of the outgoing executives in the onboarding process. What is their role and how important is it for the current and the incoming executive to work together for a period of time?
That's such a great question. And the answer to that is yes and no and maybe so. So let me tell you what that means. In some organizations, the previous executive is gone, has been gone, and there's been a gap. So literally, people that were, bless you, I think someone is, I hope someone is okay. I hear the coughing. But in any case, I think it's important to note that organizations don't always have a choice in that matter, that sometimes the position has been vacant for a while. And so in that case, the working together needs to happen with the board. The board of directors needs to step in and help to fill in the blanks. Also, the existing staff, no matter how small or how large the staff is, just like there's a technology buddy, there should be a programmatic buddy, someone who is the go-to person for any questions that come up around programming or what have you. There should always be a liaison in the event that there is no outgoing executive available for those conversations. Now, there may be a situation where there's an interim that is there. And in that case, oftentimes, not all the times, but oftentimes, interims, especially if they themselves were not an internal candidate for the role, if they were not looking to take on that role, they'll be more than happy to extend their contract to help make that a smooth transition. And oftentimes interim executives, they themselves are consultants, so they're happy to do that kind of work. That's kind of their sweet spot anyway. Now, in the case that it wasn't an interim, but it was an outgoing executive, and maybe they are moving on to their next new role, or maybe they're retiring, or whatever the case may be. It is important to be very clear on what the time frame is, whatever the time frame is. And not only that, but to check with the incoming executive, who may also have some ideas or feelings about how long that time should be. So I've seen situations where the assumption was, oh, you know, they're going to want that kind of hands-on, and the person was prepared and willing to stick around for 90 days. And the incoming executive said, hold on, that's a little too much, a little too close for comfort. All I need is 3 weeks. And then I need to be able to just give them a call if I need them. And so I think what's most important to realize is that whatever you do in the terms of that handoff, make sure that it's openly communicated, that everyone agrees to that time frame, and so everyone is familiar and aware of what the expectation is. I hope that's not a cop-out answer, but I really have seen it go so many different ways, Alicia.
Great, thanks, Tanisha. And another related question is asking a little bit more about as responsibility for each of the pieces that Jamie described. These are all great ideas, but they'd love to see models of how each of the pieces are coordinated, including what is HR's role in the process.
I want to make sure that I caught the question. It's the ideas are great, but how do you implement? Is that essentially what's being asked?
It's who implements them, other than, the outgoing president. What are the roles of everybody, such as HR, in that process?
Right, absolutely. And I want to be sensitive to the fact that some nonprofits don't have an HR also. So I think, again, it's a conversation. So there may be an office manager, there may be a pseudo HR person, or there may be a contracted HR person that can help to coordinate each of those steps and assign roles. There also oftentimes is what is called a transition committee. And that transition committee was very hands-on during the vetting and the selection process. They were privy to the interviews and all of those things. And that selection or transition team committee can also be the group that is manning those, or in charge of or owning those pieces on the other side as well. So if there is no plan in place, what I would say is look at your organizational structure. If there is an HR person or a contracted HR person, consult them so that you can lay out the steps and say, hey, I just got off this webinar and I have all these ideas. I want to come to you and brainstorm these ideas and talk about how we implement it and who owns what. If there is no HR person, look at who was part of the transition itself, who was a part of the interviewing and all of that. And then from there, you can strategize who will own putting together the swag bag, who's going to own sending flowers, who's going to own, laying out what the first 30 days will look like, given the steps that we laid out. So it really depends on the structure of your organization.
And we try to be really mindful and point out things that don't necessarily require you to reinvent your operation. Really just things that are evidence of thoughtfulness and preparedness around receipt of your new executive. And to Denisha's point, it may require someone in the organization to put on a different hat, but this is an investment, and you want to nurture your investment. It's kind of like, your new car. When you park it all the way at the other end of the parking lot, you are taking care of your investment, especially when it's shiny and new. You really, really want to keep it that way as long as possible.
That's great. Alicia, do you see any other questions in the chat that might be helpful?
One quick one is, how early after acceptance of an offer letter should onboarding begin?
Oh, that's a great question. So I would say it's important not to let your newly accepted executive get cold. Oftentimes what we see in search is that we are carefully bringing your candidate across the finish line in the midst of all manner of chaos. That could mean other agencies or firms vying for the attention and affection and acceptance of this candidate. They may have had to decide literally across 2 or 3 or even more offers. It's so funny, and I see this all the time. I know, Jamie, you'll co-sign this. When it rains, it pours. So you'll be working with an executive, and they're, hey, I know that I've got what it takes, and they've got what it takes, but things have been a little bit slow. And then all of a sudden, your search picks up, and whatever irons in the fire they have pick up. And so now all of a sudden it's time to talk about the negotiation, and they come and tell you what, Jamie? I have another offer.
You have another offer.
So if that's the case, there's, you don't want your executive to have any kind of buyer's remorse, if you will, or I don't know what the appropriate term is, but if they accepted, and especially you're privy to the fact that they accepted over and above other employers, love up on them right away. You can't smother them. It's okay to let a day or two go by, but I wouldn't let them simmer for a week untouched. Have someone call, have someone welcome, especially if it is your number one position. Have the board president and the vice president, or the board chair and the vice chair, reach out, give them a call. You can, do all the formalities as far as agenda setting and things of that nature. You can get all that on paper, but just in terms of the human element, make sure that they're hearing from people internally and externally who are aware that they have accepted. Flowers is a great touch before day one, or at least the day that they start. And then when you're going to lay out your actual agenda, it's nice if they can see the agenda before day one so they can sort of center and wrap their mind around what that first week is going to look like. It's also great to say, hey, if there's anything we've missed that you are particularly looking forward to learning in your onboarding, we are open to revising, augmenting, editing this list. So all of those things I would say are helpful when it comes to timing. But for instance, let's say what's today, Jamie? Is it the 17th, the 18th? It's the 18th.
Yeah.
If they accept on the 18th and their offer letter says they don't start until June 20th, you have a month to love up on them.
Yeah. And I think that to the attendees' question, one thing that you could do very early on, very shortly after acceptance, if I'm not mistaken, that was the question, is the questionnaire suggestion. You could send a welcome letter and the questionnaire. That lets them know right off of the top that you are in a headspace to receive them, and in a high touch way, not just welcome to the organization, but more of a welcome to the fold. What do you like? You know, what's your favorite color? What are some of your hobbies? Just again, that initial touch that lets them know that you are ready and prepared to receive them, and that you are interested in them as a human, not just a human resource.
That's it. That's it. So I'm sure that more questions will come in, Alicia, but what we'd like to do, if it's okay, is to plow forward. We have a bit more content to discuss what happens in 30 to 90 days and then what happens beyond 90 days. So this is the section, and I love what you said in our off-camera conversation, Jamie. This is really taking things from shifting from that orientation frame of mind to integration.
Mm-hmm.
Really, to your point, bringing this executive into the fold. And so what are some best practices around this piece? One, and I love what you said a moment ago about your new executive is going to have the whole rest of their time with this organization to perform. So that first 30 days really needs to be centered around relationship building, getting the lay of the land, making sure that they know that they have the margin to just breathe it in, rather than come in and start working right away. At some point, your executive is going to feel restless with that, because they are a high-powered executive for a reason, because they are an implementer, they are a doer, they get things done. And so you'll want to make sure that in this 30 to 90-day period, you're setting that process and that transition up for success. So what I always suggest is bring back out the job description, bring back out the job announcement, and use that to center what are the priorities of this role. It's so funny. It can get watered down with round one, and then round two, and then round three, and then round four, and then round 4B. And by the time you're at the end and you sign on the dotted line, it's like, now what did I agree to? So it's good to say, you know what? I hope you feel welcome by now. You know, we know your favorite color and everything. Let's pull this job description back out and just put some context around it. You have the hot issues list from last month, but we really want you to now like shift into, in the next 6 to 12 to 18 months, these are the priorities as we see it. And who's giving that information? It's the board, because the board has done the strategic planning. The board knows where the organization is headed. And so you want to start aligning around the priorities of the role and what's urgent, what's important, what's urgent and important. And so the next step from there is really to solidify those priorities into measurable goals and into performance metrics. One of the questions that I never do not get, in other words, I always get when I am prospecting for an opportunity, is how will my performance be measured? Because the thing here is, if it's a moving target or a nebulous target or a murky target, then how will anyone know if I'm doing well? And if no one knows if I'm doing well, how will I ever be rewarded? or on the converse, then I'm going to be held accountable to something that is not even defined. So this is the time in this 30 to 90 days, and sometimes it is a discussion because you may be in an executive search at a time where there's some flux or there's some change or there's a global pandemic, for crying out loud. And so things will shift. And so when you bring your executive on, it's really important to center where all of this is landing. Remember that performance is the love language of your executive. For those of you who are tracking with me, you know that there's physical touch and there's words of affirmation and quality time and giving gifts. And there's one more that I can't think of right off the break. But anyhow, for the executive, their love language is performance. And so you want to make sure that they are clear, again, on those measurable goals, that they're clear on the timing, that they have that thing crystal clear so that they can deliver, because your executive wants to deliver. Here's the DEI tip. Please remember that some leaders are going to feel an added pressure to perform. It's just a part of it, okay? It's just a part of being a diverse leader in the space. And so you want to set them up again for those clear goals. There, you know, that's another conversation for another time. But trust me when I tell you, your leaders, especially if your organization is bringing in their very first diverse leader in the history of the organization, there's a lot of added pressure where that's concerned, and there's a lot of eyes on that person, and they're going to need to feel that support. So additional best practices in this 30 to 90 days. Sometimes we'll find, especially with our smaller nonprofit organizations, that there is no current administrative support for that particular seat. And it's not always necessary, but sometimes it might be necessary for a time, especially while your executive is getting the lay of the land, especially when there's tons and tons of meetings, both internally and externally, et cetera. And so consider that. Consider hiring a contracted administrative support professional within the first 30 days and keeping that person on for 90 days to 6 months or so. And if it works out well, then hey, maybe they come on full time. If that is not in the budget, then that can be the expectation up front. Oftentimes, of course, and I highly recommend that your executive is the one to hire their full-time chief of staff or their full-time executive assistant. But just the offer of saying, hey, we do have in the budget to bring on someone who can support you from an administrative perspective while you're getting everything organized, it is very welcome indeed. And this one here, it might be more overlooked than people think, Jamie. It's to be accessible and be responsive. And this is really a note for the boards of directors, because what happens is maybe you're in a board that is contracted to meet 4 to 6 times a year. It's super governing board. You know, it's very hands off. The last executive had it. They didn't have to do a whole lot. But now there's a shift, there's a transition. And so there has to be conversation about what might we need to do as a board to rally around this person and make sure that they have what they need. And that's where the buddy system comes in, which I love what you brought up from the first 30 days. But that should go on, that should continue, because this person is still forming, storming, norming, and getting an understanding of where your organization is.
And Denisha, would you agree that this is probably that much more critical in this virtual environment?
Oh my goodness. It's the thing that's so funny about it is that if you're in an office, it probably could take longer because maybe someone left the building or someone's doing this or doing that. But in reality, it takes longer in the virtual because you've got an inbox of 250 unread emails, and you continue to decline whoever is pinging you on the Zoom live. And the next thing you know, a week has gone by and a very quick question, which should have been a quick question, is still left like a dangling participle. Mm-hmm. So it is extremely important to remember to stay responsive, stay accessible. One of the things that I love to do is voice text. Jamie can attest to this. She'll ask me a quick question over text and I'll respond on voice text because it's a little bit faster and a little bit easier. And I know that I'm getting her the information she needs, but I can continue on the flow of whatever I'm doing. So technology can help us to be accessible and to be responsive. So this last point is interesting. And again, this goes back to viewing your executive not as a human resource, but as a human. If this is now your new CEO, this is now your new executive director, this is now your new, chief financial officer or whoever, you really want to make sure that you're actively edifying and speaking highly of this person out loud and in front of and behind their back. Essentially, you want to brag on this person behind their back, because what's happening is everyone is uncomfortable with change. And so when the new person comes in, if there is a felt absence of excitement from your organization about this person coming on board, it starts to trickle down and they will start to feel it in various interactions. The DEI tip is for your new leader, you might want to be prepared to speak truth to power, because that will come up. That's not going to be a relevant point to everyone on the call, but there are some organizations on the call right now who know exactly what I'm talking about. Coming through everything with the summer of 2020, and many organizations wrote their statement, their DEI statement, and now it's time to walk the walk. And so many are saying, now's the time. We want to, all things being equal, we want to make sure that the leadership reflects the communities that we serve. And now that we've done that, this is new for everyone. And so there are going to be some conversations that are also new for everyone. And so if your leader is coming in and they are prepared to speak truth to power, you want to be prepared to edify and back that up. Now, I think I see a comment in the chat. I want to make sure. Oh, I guess that's a link. Let me continue forward. Next slide, please. All right, a few more things to keep in mind. One slide back, please. To round out this discussion on orientation to integration, this 30 to 90 days, which is really one of the meatiest stages of onboarding, is this 30 to 90 days piece. Feedback. Oftentimes we are tempted to hold feedback until the annual review, or we're tempted to hold feedback until the half-year review. Please do not do that with your new executive. You'll want to provide informal, positive feedback as you go, and timely, constructive feedback. If you come out of a meeting and you know that they didn't quite strike the chord of the feeling in the room, and they didn't strike it because they don't know those people just yet, it is perfectly appropriate to say, hey, Jamie, do you want to grab a quick coffee or a tea? Let's just debrief that meeting. How do you think things went? Okay, great. I agree. That part went well. Let me tell you some things that you may have missed, may not have been able to read the room given you're new. And just tell them. They will appreciate that kind of candor so very much. Also, allow your new executive the space to manage staff in their own way. We see this all the time, don't we, Jamie? Where the new executive comes in and whatever that transition was, had that board as an operating board. And that,
I was gonna say, especially when there's a gap in between.
Yes, there's a gap, and people are calling the board chair and they're calling the head of this committee, and they're saying we need this, and that needed to happen because there was no CEO or executive director in place. But now that there is, it can be so tough to untangle or disentangle that entanglement. So you really want to help to gently turn the staff back to your new leader and say, hey, I know 3 weeks ago, before Jamie joined us as our new executive director, it was appropriate for you to give me a call, but please go ahead and give her an opportunity to hear your concern or to ask that question and so on. If Jamie doesn't know, Jamie's going to get the information from the board. So let's not cut out the new executive, but it takes the board to direct staff back to the new executive to allow that to happen. And last but absolutely not least, ask what you can do. Well, how does the quote go? Ask not what you can do for what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. It's just like that. ask what you can do to support your new executive and be specific, especially if you noticed an outage somehow. So they, went before the finance committee or the fundraising committee, and maybe they missed a few points. So then you'll go back and say, hey, Jamie, how did you think the meeting went? Great, I agree, this part went well. One thing I was curious, could you use some support in understanding all of the different revenue streams? I noticed you hit the grant piece really hard, but didn't spend that much time on the major donors or whatever. I'm just going off the top of my head. But be specific in the ways that you might be able to offer some support. The DEI tip here is, it is not uncommon for an incoming leader to request a cultural assessment. If they go through this vetting process and they uncover that they are the very first person of color in a leadership position in this organization, that is going to make someone's spidey senses go up, and they may be interested in a cultural assessment. If they go through the vetting process and find out that the last 5 people to leave the organization were persons of color, that antenna might be going up. Be open to that. In fact, if you know that your organization is coming through some emotional or professional trauma in some way, you can even be the one to consider offering this sort of support. This sends a message to your new executive that you have your finger on the pulse. It's not that we're not woke, we're woke, but now that we're woke, we're seeing what needs to be done, we're seeing what needs to be shifted, and we are completely all hands on deck to support that change, rather than sitting back and just letting them have to come up with all those ideas. Like, it's okay to go to them and say, hey, one thing we were thinking might be helpful is some sort of a DEI assessment so that we can get things back on track. So those are some of the ideas, again, best practices that we've seen occur in that 30 to 90 day. The story's not over, right, Jamie? The story's not over. What happens next?
It is not over. So I was really excited to do the next part. Next slide, please. This is where you really take another step in protecting your investment. This is typically, I think, culturally in HR and onboarding space where we feel like this process is over. I'm not sure who came up with the first 90 days, but it's been the case the entire time I've been a professional. And the objective of today's webinar is not to just give you insight on how to onboard your nonprofit C-suite executive. The key piece is we want to make a lasting impression. So in addition to protecting our investments and setting our new executive up for success, we absolutely are approaching this in the spirit of making a lasting impression. So we are beyond 90 days and we are still onboarding our executive. So what does this look like? Next slide, please. This looks like a few things noted here on this slide. One of them is training opportunities. And so an example of training opportunities would be, let's say you hired a certified association executive rather than someone who is specifically a subject matter expert within your organization's actual program. And you are going to want to provide training opportunities for this executive so that they can get up to speed quicker and also feel confident and able to speak knowledgeably about the organization's programs and the way that it executes its mission. Another consideration beyond 90 days is going to be executive coaching. Executive coaching can look like a number of different things. It could be coaching on emotional intelligence, time management, managing change, delegating, communication, self-confidence and imposters syndrome, decision-making skills. Either way, you're going to want to center this executive coaching around developmental areas that you identified maybe in your vetting or maybe that you've identified through staying close to your executive in the first 90 days. Impact Search Advisors by Nonprofit HR actually uses a really thoughtful assessment through simple, accurate scientific methodology. This assessment allows us to know and analyze behavioral profiles of executives. And this is something that we really encourage our clients to use. And I feel like, Denisha, you had a recent example where you used our assessment.
Yes, that's so true. It's funny because prior to joining Impact Search Advisors, I was very familiar with some, like DISC, Myers-Briggs, some, each Strength Finders, which is one of my favorite indexes to use. But the one that we use here is called a PDA. And essentially what it does is it identifies the leadership style that comes most naturally to your executive. And so, for instance, maybe one spectrum is that this person is an implementing leader, but another type of leadership style would be a change agent leader, right? So if I'm looking at your index, for example, Jamie, it may say that for Jamie, she's, 91% on the spectrum of implementing leader, meaning it comes super easy to you. That's your natural behavioral style. But when I look at the profile that shows up for you as a change agent, maybe that's only 30%. So can you be a change agent? Absolutely. Have you been a change agent? 100%. But does it require more effort for you to do that work than it does for you to be an implementing leader? That's the question. And so that's the genius of this particular index, is it's showing you, especially across different candidates, if you choose Denisha, this is the natural behavioral style that she leans into, and it takes more effort for her to do this style, which she also does, as evidenced by resume and interview and cover letter and references, versus if you choose this leader over here, Jamie Armstrong, this is the kind of leadership that she naturally leans into. Why is that important with onboarding? It's important because if you had a choice between, in this example, an implementing leader and a change agent, but your organization needs both, then you're going to want to set up was a candidate, now your new leader, for success by saying, hey, what kind of coaching training might be helpful? And you're using the references, you're using the behavioral index that you choose, you're using all those things to inform those areas that may require extra support, delegation, training, what have you. What's beautiful about this when done properly is that your executive is coming into an environment where they are being poured into immediately, because it's not punitive. I mean, they've just started. This is not punitive. This is literally developmental. And it's a question. Hey, Jamie, we noticed in your references in your behavioral index that it might require, you might require some support around delegation. What can you tell us about that? And you might say, oh, I'm so glad you asked. I am constantly taking on more than I can handle. I would love to get some administrative support. Or, I saw this course that taught some new way of, approaching time management, and I'd love to be able to take that. Those are the kinds of dialogues that those indexes can really tee up for you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that example, Denisha. The last point that I want to, or the last consideration that I want to go over beyond 90 days is in line with something that you talked about, 30 to 90 days, feedback and open communication. The reason that it made this slide as well is because it shouldn't stop after the 90 days. You should constantly be engaging your new executive with ongoing feedback and creating an environment for open communication. The DEI tip for this is be careful of gaslighting and be sure that you are supporting your new executive. The biggest takeaway that we hope that all of you got from this, onboarding is more than a welcome to the job. It's a welcome to the fold. You alluded to this earlier in the call, Denisha, that we spend more time with our colleagues in a lot of instances than we do with our family. And we want to make that a good experience. It is going to slow down the executive search revolving door. It is also going to position you to strengthen your culture. And it's going to set your executive up for longevity and success. And in understanding all of the investment that we've made on the front end, I think it's fair to assume that that is absolutely the goal, to retain this person and for them to perform successfully.
Fantastic. Wow. Thank you so much for all of that information. We have, I think, roughly 15 minutes or so that we can likely entertain additional questions. Alicia, I'd love to hear if there are any further questions. And Myra,
there's our fearless leader.
Help us to address the questions of our audience. And back to you, Alicia.
Yes, thanks, Denisha and Jamie, for all the great information you just shared. It's definitely been a power-packed and informative discussion. So we have Myra joining us as well now. And so if there are any questions, please type them into the questions box and the team will get to as many questions as possible in the remaining time. But let me go ahead and start with some that have come in so far. So this question is about the outgoing executive and the role that they play with the incoming executive. What are the 3 critical things that an outgoing executive needs to do?
I'm going to sip my water and listen as our managing director comes in on this one.
Alicia, we're looking for the 3 things that the exiting executive will do. That's correct?
Exactly, the role of the executive, some top things.
Wonderful. So the first thing we want to be transparent about is that the role of the outgoing executive should really be dictated by the circumstances around their exit, right? How much they should be involved. You know, if this is a situation where they're retiring or they've given notice and it is a positive change, you know, there's always a little bit of bittersweetness to it. But more than anything, if it's a situation where there are no real negative reasons to solicit the change, then you really want to involve the outgoing executive as much as possible. I don't know how much you want to involve them in the interview process. We're not talking about that right now. We are talking about the onboarding. So you want to give them time with the new executive. Give them some one-on-one time so that they can really get in the trenches and learn what it's like to be the actual leader of this organization. You want to give them some time, and then you also really want to create space for them to be transparent outside of that conversation. Allow them to be transparent with the board of directors and letting the board know these are some of the things that you all did that were absolutely fantastic in supporting me. And these are some things that if I could ask for a bit more and get it, this is where I think that you really need to lean in. You really want to listen. And then the other piece here is do not be overbearing on either of the executives' time or resources, right? The exiting executive, whether they are rushing to retirement or to a new role, you don't want to bog them down with any more tasks than are already required by an exiting executive. But then again, you also do not want to make the new executive feel impeded in any way around them being able to take on the fullness of their new role. And sometimes that onboarding process can be a bit overbearing. I hear search committees quite often say, we've got 30 days of overlap with the outgoing executive and the new. And I just want each of you to think about if you are an executive, or maybe not even an executive, whatever role that you're currently in, if you had someone sitting with you 8 hours a day for the first 30 days of you doing your role, how would you feel about that? And I think it's also very important to ask for some insight into what the new executive feels like they need. So you need some transparency from your exiting leader. You also need a bit of their time, right? But you also want to be very careful about making sure that their time is not only one-on-one with the new executive, but really listen to what they have to say about things that they needed when they were on board so that we can improve experiences moving forward.
Great. Thanks, Myra. Another question is asking about the staff's role. So they said, do you have a session with staff on expect with a new CEO?
I'll jump in there. And, you know, sometimes I know attendees might come in mid-webinar, but there was a section that we spoke to about with staff. You have an opportunity to do both informal and formal meet and greets. So that might look like before day one, just popping in. I had an example, and I thought this was adorable, where the executive was local to the headquarters. And so those folks that had pets all got together and they walked their dogs together. That was the very first time that they met one another. It was like a dog walking moment. And I just thought, wow, how fun and easy breezy. And it was staff all levels and really kind of broke the ice, if you will, because again, put yourself in the position of everybody's getting a new boss and people are not so sure, especially those who may not have had an opportunity to be in the interview process. So these are great informal ideas. But then when you look at the first 30 days, when you're setting up that agenda, 100% all staff meetings are fantastic so that they can be formally welcomed, that people can get to know them. I have a client now who's going through the onboarding process. Going back to the question that Myra answered, she was invited to dinner of the previous founding executives at their home, met their family. The outgoing executive was coming off of a 3-month sabbatical and had no intention of continuing their term with the organization. Everything was on the up and up and very positive. But that, I just thought that was a wonderful gesture and really gave everyone an opportunity to get to know one another and open up those lines of communication. And then on the staff side, they were able to set up, I guess, what would be the virtual equivalent of a fireside chat. And so there was a moderator, and they offered questions from the staff, and they were sort of anonymized. So the new executive didn't know who was asking the questions, and there was some levity involved. And so it was just a very light, bright way to introduce the executive to the staff. But, you know, the short answer to the question is you can be as creative. That the issue is to get it down on paper, get it down into a plan so that everyone knows what to expect. It's where we get into hot water is, well, when are we going to meet this person? And then lo and behold, the first meeting is like a one-on-one, or, you know, some like, you know, God forbid, some punitive or, you know, tough feedback or something like that. So you really want to be mindful that you're facilitating a process of building trust in that relationship.
Thanks, Denisha. And another question is about when you have a board member that ends up going into an executive staff role, do you do anything differently in those situations?
I've actually had that happen a number of times, actually. And I think you take it on a case-by-case basis. I think in some instances, you really do want to manage the process as you would with anyone else so that your new executive gets the actual new executive onboarding experience and nothing is neglected or taken for granted that they may or may not know, or an experience that may or may not be valuable to them. However, we do want to deal in not only fact, but in reality, correct? And what that means is that we want to remember and think about, has this executive director or this new CEO had any run-ins with the team that could potentially negatively affect their transition from the board to an in-house executive? And if those are some of the things that are in place, it's a place where you can use executive coaching or some sort of mentor relationship, so to speak, or mediation is actually what the word that I'm looking for. The fireside chat that Denisha just mentioned would be a fantastic way to get staff involved, to ask some questions about how do you plan to transition your leadership style from being a member of a governing body to now being internal to the organization where you're actually responsible for the development of your team. And there are some very important nuances to the relationship between a board of directors and the staff of an organization, as well as the executive director or CEO and the staff of that organization. So it stands to reason that that executive will need some assistance and support in transitioning into that relationship, or even transitioning from that vantage point, from that point of view, in terms of how they're viewing the team, how they view their responsibility in coming up with solutions. And I think executive coaching is something that can be very useful in helping them make that transition. So there's a little bit of both. You do want to make sure that you hit all of the spots. You won't want to neglect the fact that they know where the coffee machine is. You don't want to neglect the fact that they already know how to submit expense reports or anything of that nature. So they should get all of that in the same way that anyone else would. But then you also want to deal with the reality of the situation, which is that you have worked with this person before. You do understand the dynamic of the relationships that they have with stakeholders, funders, people internal to the team. And it's also very important to use that opportunity to manage those relationships, as well as the transition from that person being a governing member of the board to now being a CEO or executive director of the organization.
Great, thanks. And then here's a question, and if we have time, maybe each of you can chime in on this, and I'll start with Jamie. What is one thing that maybe you recall that a new C-suite executive wished their team did for them in the first 30 days? Any thoughts from your past?
Typically something would immediately come to mind. I can't think of anything. Nothing's coming to mind.
Okay, so maybe on the flip side, something that somebody mentioned here, something that resonated that you've heard a new C-suite executive liked that was done during their onboarding.
The questionnaire. Yep, I'm going to live by the questionnaire. It's just extremely thoughtful. And as I mentioned earlier in the call, it lets them know that you're prepared and you were ready to receive them, not just as a human resource, obviously, because they're going to be everyone's new boss, but as a human. I have heard a couple of variations of the questionnaire approach. It's a great initial high touch, and you can't go wrong with it.
I'm going to piggyback on that, Jamie. On the one hand, what I hear most often is that a new executive comes into an organization and instantly feels the chatter or the circumstances around the transition. Like there has been no coaching of the staff to say, Michelle Obama's coming to our house, and we need to at least try to put on our best pair of shoes and, give at least a good week of good and decent behavior. No one wants to come into a mess. And, sometimes people just need to have that centering moment beforehand. It's not that there's a lack of authenticity or anything like that, but it can be disconcerting to walk into an environment and there's gossip or there's just something that doesn't feel welcoming. On the other hand, I'm going to tell you a quick story about the newest COO for a client of ours who called me. I was the search consultant who placed her, and called me so frantic. And I'm thinking, what awful thing has happened to this woman? And what it was, she had just received her favorite meal from her favorite restaurant delivered to her home. And it just seems so small. But for her, the fact that the organization took the time to find out what was her favorite meal at her favorite place and take it to her home was huge. It was huge. And it just spoke volumes, especially in this virtual environment where it is a bit more challenging. It requires a bit more pre-thought and organization to pull something off. And it wasn't for anything other than to just say, hope you've had a great first week. Hope you have an enjoyable Friday night. We'll see you on Monday. And I just thought, how classy is that?
That's a great story, Denisha. And if I could piggyback on the first part of what Denisha talked about, what I've heard that executives are looking for is true transparency, right? A lot of times we're doing a little bit too much preparing for Michelle Obama to a point that it is not realistic in terms of what the new executive can expect on a day-to-day basis. So we need to be prepared to make sure that they feel welcome, everyone showing up, to welcome them and share correctly. But it's also very important that if there are any landmines, that you give them the map. They've already said yes. They've already signed the employment agreement, and you've hired this person to come on and make a difference in your organization. And they absolutely cannot do that if they are consistently fighting gotcha moments. They just can't. They can't do that if there are things about your organization that for some wild and crazy reason you're hoping that they will never find out. They will not be able to do that if there are things that are obvious that you chose to withhold from them. And that is 100% going to be the detriment of the relationship and the tenure of that executive. They've taken the job, and 9 times out of 10, they've done more research than you think they have in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly concerning your organization, because it's a part of their career's legacy. We're not talking about people that are moving around in mid-career positions. We're talking about people who are executives in organizations. And if they make a choice to come to your organization, you better believe they've done some research. And they will count it as an offense if there is something that you have chosen to withhold from them. So transparency is key in the midst of all of the pleasantries and wonderment that will go into making them feel welcome. Also, make sure you let them know we brought you flowers because there's something real bad behind this door, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be, that direct, but there definitely needs to be a conversation around the real issues that you want them to help solve.
I like the word track. Give them the map.
That's it.
Give them the map.
Great.
The flowers and the map.
All fabulous advice, all great ideas. Once you get the executive in the door, there's still a lot more to do once you've selected them, and you have to get them in the door and keep them going down the road. Those are all It's all great information that our presenters provided. So thank you again for everybody attending. Thank you for our panelists. Thank you to our panelists for leading today's discussion. We do have many, many more webinars coming your way in 2021, so be sure to check out our events calendar at nonprofithr.com/events. And I know there were some more questions in the questions panel. We will be sure to answer some of those and provide the recording to this webinar, as well as the slides and any other helpful things. You should get that within the next week, including the Sherman HRCI recertification codes. Please be sure to complete the feedback survey that's going to pop up once the webcast has ended, because your comments certainly help with our planning and can inform future topics we cover as well. So if you'd like more information about available services or support from Nonprofit HR or Impact Search Advisors by Nonprofit HR, please email info@nonprofithr.com or visit us on the web at www.nonprofithr.com. So thank you to everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.